Thanks, John, and good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Dowling, and I lead Accenture's digital identity practice for Asia Pacific. And once again, very proud to be the global headline sponsor for these events. And good to be here again in Sydney in this fantastic location. I remember this time last year looking out over the window behind us, and there was this great commotion going on across the harbour. Helicopters flying around and everything, and it turned out it was the martial arts legend Jackie Chan was making a film here. And he was doing stunt work right on the very top of the sails on the Opera House there. So hopefully Fordrock has planned another great event for us today. Accenture every year produces this thing called a technology vision. And it's a year-long study by our technology labs around what are some of the trends happening 3 to 5 years out. Inevitably, there's always at least one or two security-related trends as well. So our cybersecurity labs have come up with our own vision, funnily enough, called the Security Technology Vision. And this year's topic was really around the concept of a self-sustaining enterprise. So I'll take you through what a self-sustaining enterprise is, and particularly, given this is an identity conference, the role that identity has to play in that, which is quite important. So I think we've heard a bit about the ecosystem and all the the connected devices and everything, and the great degree of connectedness from business partners and so on as well. So that whole ecosystem is getting very, very complex and needs a new way of thinking about it. So we like to look at the analogy of the ecosystem as a neighbourhood. So think of your own neighbourhood. You have your family members that live there, your neighbours that you know well, the neighbours that you don't know so well, that might be strangers. The people that might regularly come in and out that you know, like the person walking his dog at the same time every day along the neighbourhood. But then also there's some strangers coming in, some people that may not be regular, the commuters, the Uber drivers, the taxi drivers. And who knows, if Amazon gets their way, then unmanned vehicles and drones delivering things, or even errant connected basketballs bouncing down the street. Many of those, every one of those things has an identity, and it's important to know, who you can trust and who you can't. So similarly, businesses need to have a very good understanding of all the people, devices, things that are taking part in that ecosystem. So in other words, who is in your neighbourhood? And that provides a good backdrop to our definition of what a self-sustaining enterprise is, right? So it's effectively an organisation that's able to understand who's moving in and out of that neighbourhood, what they're trying to do, and what they're wanting to achieve, what their relationship is, and what threats they represent. And then knowing that, being able to respond appropriately. So there's a few key characteristics of a self-sustaining enterprise, right? First is the ability to sense and respond, right? And having great agility doing that. Going back to our neighbourhood analogy, if you see a stranger coming in to your neighbourhood, approaching your house, what are some of the things you might do? You might hive your valuables away in a room and maybe just peer out the window. You might race around and lock all the doors, turn off all the lights, and pretend that there's no one home. Right? Or you might go out, open the door, greet the neighbour, and find out who they are and what they want. So how we would do that as individuals depends on our own risk threshold, if you like. So similarly with, from a business perspective, they need the agility to be able to do those, that sort of, understanding who's in the neighbourhood. So understanding identities obviously is a key important part of that. But you also need the telemetry and the data required to make those decisions. Obviously, with all that data, needing to use predictive analytics, cognitive modelling, and so on to be able to process that information and take a lot of the thinking process out of the equation. Then, once you know who's in your neighbourhood and what they're looking, you need to be able to respond. So, a self-sustaining enterprise will have, start to look at having the ability to shift the infrastructure around, dynamically change their environment in order to respond to some of those changes in the ecosystem. And I'll talk more about that later. So why do we need to do this? We're seeing an enormous wave of new cyber risks that are happening in most business ecosystems today. The first is around the proliferation of insecure devices. I mean, Mike talked about the 20 billion connected devices that might be around by 2020. So all the sensors, connected cars, wearable devices, basketballs as well. All of those inherently could present a new attack vector for an organisation. And with the pace to try and be first to market with producing these devices, that rate of change is really outpacing the industry's ability to wrap some standards and guidelines around how to effectively use some of those devices as well. Secondly, we're merging our personal and our professional lives in a way that we've never done before. Who uses the same device for connecting to work and personal emails? Just about everyone in the room, right? So, with the advent of and the push around BYOD, there's work devices being used for personal use, or personal devices being brought into the workplace. Some organisations are even starting to look at enabling smartwatches and things like that for access. I've got a very dumb watch. It just tells the time. But each of these things is actually then leading to the ability for attackers to be able to weaponize the internet in ways that has not been anywhere near as possible as before. So, we've seen examples of that with some of the organised campaigns like WannaCry recently, or even some more targeted campaigns in the past, like Stuxnet and so on. Recently in Victoria, a number of the speed cameras, red light cameras, were infected, with the WannaCry virus by just a technician just plugging in a USB stick to provide an update. So, luckily, that was a fairly benign result. But imagine if that was a more prolific and destructive, virus. So, what are some of the fundamentals of things that you need to look at as a self-sustaining enterprise? First is the ability to really, in real time, have discovery of what the assets are out there, right? And they could be new people, devices, even data, systems, applications, and so on. Identity is important to understand that. As I mentioned, each one of those devices will have an identity. Even this basketball has its own unique identity with the ARM chip that's inside it. It's also important to understand the relationships between those identities, and that's a big area. Mike touched on that earlier this morning as well. So, what people, what devices are associated with specific individuals, or from an operational technology perspective, what sensors or might be associated with particular controllers. So, having that relationship modelling as well. We also need to have a trust-based authentication process, right? So every asset in your business would have a trust level associated with it, right? What is the level of trust the individual or device that is required in order to interact with that asset? So in order to make these trust-based decisions on the fly, the third fundamental is really then having an intelligent security platform that's able to make all those decisions on the fly, but also that has the intelligence and the automation built into it to make that actually achievable at the scale we're talking about today. On the topic of trust, I mean, we talked about that earlier as well. So, really, digital trust is the cornerstone, really, of the digital economy. Without it, an organisation really is not able to use or share a lot of the information that they have and need to use as part of their business. On a similar technology vision exercise that we did last year, we came up with this graphic representation of digital trust. And if you look at the blue things on the bottom, most of those, they're mostly the things that you will see in a typical security program. Right? Things like application security, infrastructure security, governance and compliance, cyber defence, and so on. And if you look at what's from midnight to 3 o'clock, right, on the top right-hand side, really that's the privacy principles, right? Transparency, informed consent, and so on, and we should all be familiar with those. But what's really interesting is what's from the top left, right, from 9 o'clock to midnight, and they're things that are really at the intersection of analytics, intelligence, and business intelligence, and so on, and the data itself. Right, so Tim was talking about using analytics and getting getting insight around the data and inferences around that. But what actions are you actually taking on those inferences? Are those actions in line with the intent that the data was provided in the first place? Right? So we refer to that as digital ethics, and as you're broadening out in your ecosystem, as you're sharing your information with your business partners and so on, you need to think about what are they inferring from that data, and what actions are they taking on that as well. So it's really important to have a conversation about this within whatever ecosystem that you're playing in, to understand what your posture is around digital trust, both individually and collectively as an ecosystem. So I wanted to briefly then touch on what are some of the actions to enable yourself as a self-sustaining enterprise, and I'll go through some of these in a little bit more detail. First of these is obviously having a very sophisticated identity methods. Mike talked about a lot of the things around integrating IoT and having identities for the Internet of Things. Tim talked about omni-channel, multi-channel identity and so on. So to get that sort of seamless integration, you need an identity platform that's able to recognise and manage the identity of all those things. But not just once, right? Not just a one-off, authenticate, I'm done, but have the concept of what we call a persistent identity. So looking at behavioural analysis to continually authenticate or authorise people through that journey. I mean, we've been doing some R&D around looking at how a user types on a keyboard, or how a user uses a mouse, or even how someone navigates their own file system. Tells a lot about an individual. Going serverless, this is basically taking your business process, your applications, breaking them down into atomic chunks and implementing those through a series of events or triggers and microservices. Is there anyone that's been going down that path in the room? A few people, yeah. I mean, we've seen a big rise and a lot of interest in this path because, if you think about it, those microservices have a very small footprint in your organisation. They run on demand, and they can scale up and down dynamically. On that note, also think about, from a security and infrastructure point of view, how can you treat that as a business process? And how can you break that up into atomic parts and virtualize some parts of it using, software-defined infrastructure, software-defined security concepts, to be able to think of, security and infrastructure as code. And then becoming dynamic. So, being able to deal with, at machine speed, being able to deal with and sense and react to some of these threats, and using software-defined infrastructure, moving your infrastructure around. If part of the infrastructure gets compromised, have the ability to just quarantine it, shut it down, spin up a new replacement infrastructure, or maybe hide or obfuscate some of that. Basically, so to reduce the ability for an attacker to get a foothold in that environment. I'm an identity guy. This is an identity conference. Can't really have a slide, or need to have a slide around identity. And some of the trends that we're seeing, some of this has already been talked about. With the rapid, the need to get sort of rapid ROI and have that digital-like agility. Gone are the days of having a year-long identity program. So we're seeing a lot of drive for DevOps, continuous integration, churning out releases every week, every month from an identity platform. That's becoming key. I've talked about continuous persistent authentication, serverless. Tim talked about how the customer is at the centre and actually influencing what we do from an identity perspective, and we're seeing that as well in terms of the authentication methods that may need to be used. Right, a lot of that needs to be driven by the customer themselves, and in terms of what's right for them, what's right for the channels that they like to interact with. Data privacy, you'll hear a lot about that today. And biometrics and the blockchain. A lot of people. Has anyone sort of started using blockchain from an identity perspective? Not yet. Okay. You either love it or you hate it. But we are seeing an uptake in the use of blockchain, particularly in broad ecosystems where you may want to have a distributed trust model. And we've been doing some work with the United Nations around using the blockchain to actually deliver an identity for millions of refugees around the world, and having that as a sort of distributed and ever-evolving mechanism. The opportunity from an identity perspective, won't dwell on that too much. We've had some discussions around that already. The key important point, though, is getting the maths right around the ROI. Right? So understanding how these particular identity elements actually have meaningful, bottom line impact. So, for example, if you provide a seamless user experience from your identity platform, will increase customer experience, which will then have customers doing more, buying more, which can lead to then increase in market share or uplift in revenue. Similarly, from a security point of view, more security reduces risks, which might mean reduction in operational risk premiums or cyber risk insurance, for example, that many executives are paying now. So it can have a bottom line impact. So to summarise, there is a journey to becoming a self-sustaining enterprise, right? And there's a number of steps along the way. First of all, understand the goals. What is your posture going to be? And secondly, looking at identifying the applications and the business processes that you can start to break out and separate from the infrastructure that they're running on, virtualize them, put them in the cloud, implement them through microservices. And then consider how you can do that from a security point of view as well. How can you share security services across your broader ecosystem? How can you use that to actually have dynamically shift and morph your infrastructure? Building a robust identity management system, as I said, one that can manage and understand all identities, right? Whether they be people, whether they be things. And then use analytics, cognitive, behavioural modelling and automation to actually be able to think and react, like an organizer, like a organic entity, right? But be able to do it at machine speed. So please, you're welcome to come and join us at the stand. Talk to myself or other members of the team, and hear about some of the things that we're doing around what we call the new, around DevOps, automation, and artificial intelligence, and how we're applying that to the field of identity, and hear about our Velocity program. So on that, thanks, and I'll hand back to John.